Anne Lister, from the first call on Anne Walker, dominates the physical space. She strides around the entire room and examines its contents before returning to little Anne. "Shall I sit here?" she says, sitting right where Anne Walker was sitting clearly before she arrived, all but compelling little Anne to take a seat right next to her. Big Anne proceeds to deploy a charm offensive, unflagging interest in anything Anne Walker cares to share with her, compliments, and the killer smile. That's what it says in Sally Wainwright's script, by the way, Killer Smiles, which obviously had to have been written after Suranne Jones was cast. Hashtag, I love you, Suranne Jones. In contrast to Anne Walker's comments about her sister's loss of freedom, burdened with the needs of 3 children, and Anne Walker's clear desire not to be compelled to give birth, Anne Lister waxes philosophical and passionate about the abilities of the human brain, its ability to create, to invent, to analyze. And it's obvious that she considers the brain the organ of agency, the means of fulfilling the potential with which every tiny, inexplicably delightful moment is packed, and that she deeply desires to communicate this to the shy Anne Walker. Now, even the most devoted Gentleman Jack enthusiasts begin at some point during the second episode, if not earlier, to question the predatory flavor of some of Anne Lister's interactions with her neighbor. That is, the way she seems to be trying to use her position of social and personal power to seduce Anne Walker. However, it's also the case that Big Anne begins to build up little Anne's sense of self-confidence right from the start, and continuing through to the end of the 3rd episode and beyond. The 3rd episode, of course, is as much as we'll be able to cover today. And my argument would be that Anne Lister is thus building up Anne Walker's agency and her ability to give informed consent, specifically in all areas of her life. So now I want to introduce that topic of consent into our discussion alongside the Anne power dynamic. So let's take a minute to cover some essentials of consent as it pertains to sexual activities in particular. The mnemonic device FRIES is sometimes used to give the concept of consent fuller meaning. It's not perfect, but it helps to delineate the borders of that concept. Points out that consent is not simply saying yes, but doing so under certain conditions. So consent must be freely given. That is, without explicitly or implicitly coercive elements, which could actually include asymmetrical power relationships. It's reversible, meaning it's not consent if you can't withdraw it. Informed consent means that the consenting individual knows what they're consenting to. Enthusiastic, that can be a little bit difficult to determine or difficult to define, but it suggests that consent is eager and ongoing throughout the encounter. And specific, well, consent may be given for one activity, but that doesn't mean that it's given for another. Consent ideally is verbal. That would create the least possible conditions for misinterpretation. But as we will see, it is not exclusive to verbal communication. Let's consider one of the Anne's first topics of conversation, Dr. Kenny's inappropriate staring and overfamiliarity. Anne is accustomed to submitting to his examinations, even though she doesn't like them. She consents to them, but not because of any real concern necessarily for her health. It seems to be rather a desire not to stir up trouble in the tribe. That, by the way, is not consent. Anne Lister points out unequivocally that Anne Walker has rights commensurate with her age, intelligence, and wealth. You are an intelligent 29-year-old woman of substantial, seriously substantial, independent means. Which doctor you choose to patronize is a matter for yourself and yourself alone. And at this moment of encouragement and reinforcement, cue the hand-holding, because hashtag Anne fucking Lister. Little Anne then perfectly frames the problem with asserting her rights. She has long been perceived as an invalid, making her vulnerable to the wishes of others. How? You don't seem very invalid to me, Anne replies. The change in pronunciation does not go unnoticed by little Anne or by us. The message is clear, your opinion matters, and has validity. Anne Lister at this point is still very much in control of the situation, which is very promising for her. Anne says almost smugly, all she needs to do now is realize that the nature of what she feels for me is love. Now, I just want to point out here that when Big Ann realizes that the nature of what she feels for little Ann is love, she's going to get hers. Still, at the next visit, Ann Lister continues to bolster little Ann's powers of agency, this time with respect to her financial affairs. She dictates the first letter to Cousin Atkinson, in which wealthy little Miss Walker will not consent to hand over money without a full accounting of what he intends to do with it and how he's going to pay it back. But here, Big Ann's purpose is not to treat Ann Walker as a puppet, but rather to provide a scaffold on which little Ann can build her competencies in dealing with opportunistic relatives. She even says, perhaps now you'll have the confidence to compose something yourself. However, Big Ann soon finds herself out of control again, just when she's making headway. Little Ann plans to go away for 3 weeks to the Lake District, and she's going to be out of Big Ann's influence when she does so. Ann Lister, you may have noticed, doesn't do well when she's feeling out of control, when she's powerless. So whether it's accidentally or on purpose, she snaps a paper knife in half and injures her hand. By design or not, she takes full advantage of the opportunity to be in debt to Ann Walker, not only for the property damage, but for the attentive medical care. What better time to suggest a joint vacation to Switzerland? Self-serving, opportunistic, certainly. But perhaps she also sees that foreign travel will open little Ann's mind, and the experience will increase her confidence and her powers of agency. I see I must be uncommonly and fastidiously delicate in leading her into my own ways, Ann's voiceover informs us, which feels more than a little bit sneaky and sly. But note that the operative word here is leading. Not forcing, not tricking, not blackmailing, but leading the way along a path that Ann Walker already seems predisposed to walk anyway. As their tete-a-tete continues, Ann leverages the power of her worldly experience and familiarity with intriguing foreign customs, skillfully getting Ann Walker to beg for the information about pocket holes, and then deftly maneuvering her innocent neighbor into a discussion about physical intimacy. Just a small interjection here to note that Ann's usual preference for the power position is demonstrated even in the very memorable flashback sequence with Maria Barlow, in which we're treated to a view of Ann Lister as the agent of physical pleasure and Maria Barlow as the recipient. Oh my God. Ann's careful directing of the conversation and reading of little Ann's interest allows her to create a situation in which it will be little Ann who asks the questions, who, when, that reveal Ann's desire to kiss her. And even when she does reveal this, as Mertzman and Schwartz have pointed out in Collarbones of Consent, her physical position is non-threatening, almost submissive. Ann then begins to suggest and introduce words and ideas that allow Ann to begin to define the nature of her own feelings. I think you're a little bit in love with me, Big Ann says, and since Ann Walker doesn't know how to answer that, she further prompts, have I overstepped the mark? I've embarrassed you. I've offended you. Would you like me to go? Have I misread it? I've horrified you. You despise me. But little Ann's reflexive answers to all of those statements are respectively, let me get it right, no, 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 oh Lord, and I could never despise you, Ann. Don't ever imagine that, not for a second. As Big Ann would say, well then, you don't need to be frightened, Big Ann says before she leaves. And the 38-second scene, it's 38 seconds, I counted, of Ann Walker fondling a bloody handkerchief and smiling through the window into the distance. This scene affirms for us that Ann Walker is anything but frightened.